Besides improvements brought about by science and technology, there were improvements in the political and economic aspects of European civilization that powerfully reinforced this belief in optimism. Things have been getting better, and they will continue to get better. The evidence has proved this in the past, and hopefully will continue it into the future. For example, as we saw in the instances of Britain and France in our discussion of liberal government, the broadening of the franchise and the influence of liberal ideas in 19th century Europe provided powerful impetus to those who saw progress in terms of extending the rights enjoyed by the middle classes to those below them. By the 1860s, the working classes believed they were entitled to a larger share of the industrial wealth that workers believed that they had helped produce. Consequently, the last quarter of the century saw an increase in trade union activity, as well as the development of socialist parties and other organizations that championed solidarity with the working classes, as we shall see in subsequent lectures. In many quarters, and not just among the workers, but also among a great many of the middle class and even elite leaders, there was a sense of optimism that the world was indeed improving and that there would be a continuation of this improvement. Indeed, accelerating amelioration in the quality of life enjoyed by all citizens, even the poor. Problems, then, of industrial Europe may ultimately take care of themselves. The examples of this optimism can be expressed in the growth of workers' rights and wages. In Britain, the Trade Unions Congress grew from 114,000 members in 1868 to 735,000 in 1873. In just 5 years, an increase of over 500,000. By 1892, the number had risen to 1.5 million members. By the end of the century, working class wages on average in Britain, Germany, and France had increased by 20 to 25%. But at the same time, the productivity of workers with the improvements in machinery had also greatly increased, which meant even more profits for employers, even when the capital reinvestment was taken into consideration necessary to buy those machines. Workers then, seeing the increased production and the increased profit, began to agitate for a greater share of these profits. Moreover, liberalism was having a profound political influence on social and industrial legislation. As we've seen, by the late 1800s, governments recognized that workers must be protected against abuses by employers. Child labor, dangerous working conditions, and inhumane treatment of workers were slowly being legislated out of existence throughout much of the continent. It was now argued that industry was a foundation of the nation, a means of keeping the state strong and competitive. So a well-fed, hard-working labor force could help in the struggle for markets and for a greater share of the world economy. This was an interesting development because workers were now seen as fellow citizens, and also in this world where war was still a possibility, these would be the soldiers on the front, in the field, and so it was wise to keep them well-fed and healthy. Liberalism then had worked its magic, and there was a growing belief that improving the conditions of the most vulnerable would have a positive influence on the material and not just the moral structure of European society. The collection of statistics and the use of quantitative arguments, as we saw in the last lecture, powerfully reinforced this perspective by providing clear, unequivocal evidence of the benefits of progressive change. And these changes can now be seen as not moral, but economic. The idea of the early 19th century was that, in fact, there was a moral obligation to help the poor, something that was left from the traditional practices of religion and the practice of charity. Now there was a sense that a well-fed, well-trained, educated, secure, and socially integrated labor force was part of a modern industrial society. In other words, the distinction among classes was in some ways beginning to become a little less clear, especially once the working classes were brought into the political structure through the extension of the franchise. So workers were by the late 19th century receiving the benefits that the middle classes had gained by mid-century. By 1871, there was universal manhood suffrage in Germany and France. In Switzerland by 1874, England by 1886, Spain 1890, Belgium by 1893, Italy in 1912. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Balkan states had restricted suffrage, while Russia and the Ottoman Empire lacked even a constitution. So change had happened, but it wasn't yet universal across the continent. As liberals, such as John Stuart Mill had argued, giving the working class the vote made them part of the system, as opposed to keeping them outside and consequently more dangerous. The argument that Mill made is that if you were going to, in fact, make sure that the new industrial working class would become part of society rather than a threat to it, it was necessary to give them the responsibility that enjoying the franchise and the right to public office entailed. So it was a wise decision to include them, and this argument was used powerfully for the extension of the franchise. And despite urgings from radical socialists, those doctrinaire Marxists whom we will meet later, that revolution was the only solution, the working class was largely willing to work within democratic structures and within established legitimate political parties, such as the British Labour Party or the French Socialist Party or the German Social Democratic Party, all of which survive to this day and all of which hold public office. As a result, the revolutionary tendencies of the working classes were curtailed, and even, in some instances, abandoned, with socialist parties becoming an acceptable and accepted and significant part of the political spectrum of most European states, as we shall see. What effect did this have on the national collective unconscious of most Europeans, particularly those with property? How do they feel about their monopoly on power and privileges being eroded from below by those who had little property, or in some instances none? Well, the most telling effect was that the old fears and divisions among people and nations were dissolving into different forms of political and economic organization. And by the 1880s, in the most successful industrial economies, members of the working class were seen less as dangerous and immoral, and more as fellow citizens in a national economic, political, and social contract. These were no longer classe laborieuse, classe dangereuse, but rather, in fact, much more the idea that they were citizens who functioned in a different realm, who had perhaps less wealth, but nevertheless the same commitment to the community, the same commitment to the nation, and those who were making a contribution in their own way. But how did this manifest itself politically? How did this profound change in attitude on the part not only of the industrial working classes, but also of the property-owning elites, really manifest itself in a political manner? Well, the spread of fundamental social legislation in Europe succeeded in blunting the attraction of radicalism and also helped integrate the workers into a democratic political system more than any other policy. This was something that was done consciously. It was part not just of the program of liberal parties, but also, in some instances, almost a cynical decision to ensure that the classe laborieuse would not be classe dangereuse, but fellow citizens in whom a paternalistic state would take interest. Progressive and very beneficial legislation, then, sent powerful messages to all groups in society. The best example here is Germany. For example, in 1883, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck passed legislation to enact a health insurance law that was paid for by joint worker-employer contributions. This was the first example of a national health program reflecting the liberal belief that the community has responsibilities to its weakest members, particularly in times of crisis such as catastrophic illness. Then in 1884, a law calling for the creation of accident insurance was passed, with employers paying all the premiums. And then finally in 1889, an old age and invalidity law, paid for by government contributions, was instituted in order to provide pensions and disabilities for older Germans. It's interesting to note that the traditional retirement age of 65 was determined as a consequence of this legislation. Bismarck had the actuaries work out a reasonable length of life after the age of 65 so that this economic system could be relatively self-financing and relatively stable and secure. And the age in the 1880s it was determined was 65. Now, of course, we live much longer and the complications are beginning to become clear. The need for such legislation can be illustrated by noting that in the 15 years between 1885 and 1900, 50 million benefit claims were paid under the sickness, accident, and age disability provisions of the legislation in Germany. Well, the success of this German experiment led to the passage of similar laws to ensure the health and security of the population in Austria-Hungary, in Denmark, in Norway, in Belgium, in Switzerland, England, Italy, and France. causing most observers to accept that such laws justified and represented progress. Those concerned about the plight of the poor could rejoice that something positive and concrete was being done by government and by business, that in fact the poor were being cared for, and not through charity on an individual basis, but through legislation that treated everybody the same, and so that all of the needs of society could be covered fairly and equitably by the entire community. It's interesting to note that the German state, in effect, legislated cooperation, legislated community through social through social legislation. This social legislation, then, was the enacting of policy. It is the liberal belief that you have to have active involvement and active engagement if problems are to be truly solved. And indeed, the success of this and the paternalism of the German Empire and the nationalism created and the identification of all classes with the German state proved, in fact, that Bismarck, although he perhaps was somewhat cynical at the beginning, was right. And he succeeded in building a Germany based upon a set of principles shared by all, regardless of class, wealth, or position. Thus, the benefits of 19th century industrialization were now reaching far more members of society than ever before by 1900. The belief in progress in science seemed warranted, as Europe was indeed much fairer, much richer, much more progressive than just a half century before. And the expectations were that this progress towards a better world would continue almost indefinitely. There was also real progress and prosperity for all Europeans through industrialization. The mechanization of transportation in particular made travel and communications faster, cheaper, and more available than ever before. The industrial economy stabilized, and the introduction of fast, mechanized means of transport like railroads and screw propeller steamships meant, for example, that food could be moved around the country and around the world very quickly. Food became cheaper, reducing the incidence of famine in Europe. And indeed, really, by the time we reached the last decades of the 19th century, for the first time in recorded history, it was possible to abolish famine in Europe because food could be moved quickly and cheaply, whereas previously, those areas where the harvest was bad would suffer, and there wasn't too much that many people could do about it. Moreover, the cheapness of food allowed a greater discretionary income on the part of the industrial working class, a discretionary income that was then used for the consumption of goods. This in turn increased volume, which reduced price. Adam Smith's unseen hand was working in a way that he never imagined, and David Ricardo's iron law of wages was proved to be simply wrong. This industrialized transportation system and advances in chemical fertilizers and the efficient agricultural machinery produced enough food to sustain the very rapid growth of industrial cities, concentrating labor, capital, and machinery ever more efficiently. The European city then became the center not just of culture and of administration and bureaucracy. It became a place where goods were produced and where people who produced those goods participated in the community and in the culture of those cities in a very, very remarkable way. And we can see this again in the example of the street railway. The railroad was invented, first of all, in the mines in order to move the heavy ore easily and relatively quickly up to the mine head. Then, with the introduction of the steam engine, the railway then moved those heavy goods and people from one part of the country to another. But then the introduction of the railway to the streets of the city meant that, in fact, workers could live farther away from their place of employment. And huge cities like London, Paris, and so on could grow, and they could grow to sizes previously impossible without urban transportation. And the implications of this, again, become very interesting. It, for example, allowed for class geography. No longer were workers in the same area, regardless of wealth, required to live together because they had to be able to walk to work. Now there could be neighborhoods determined by social economic status. You had places where the workers could live together relatively cheaply, take the street railway to work. Areas where the middle-class managers could live more expensively and perhaps a bit more elegantly, and they could take the transportation to work. The class geography also separated not just the groups within society, but the functions of society. So, for example, you have the administrative center, but then you have the areas of the industrial factories, the production centers, again, usually separated by distance now, so you don't have to work within the smell and the noise of the factories. You also have areas where there could be concentrations of cultural activities, universities, so on. In other words, the modern city, with its extreme complication, was largely made possible by industrialization in the application of those principles to urban design. And in fact, what we see in Europe is that those cities that had the least effective means of urban transportation were those that were the most dangerous and the most unhealthy, whereas those that had the most effective means of urban transportation, such as London and Paris, that even had underground railways, the underground in the metro, permitted very, very sophisticated operations that allowed for the health, security, safety, and economic well-being of huge proportions of the population, regardless of class. It was a remarkable revolution, and it produced the Europe that we essentially know. Manufacturing continued in order to expand with a constant introduction of new technology. As technology changed, so in fact did the nature of industrialization itself. And the implications of even small changes were often huge. The unintended consequences of the introduction of particular kinds of machines altered the nature of European society in very interesting ways. For example, the introduction of the sewing machine, a relatively simple piece of equipment in the 1850s, further quickened the pace of clothing production, increasing, in fact, the rate of clothing production by 25% in the decade between 1850 and 1860. Clothing, though, was already inexpensive, and changing fashion was available almost to all classes. But now these things became even cheaper, and fashion could change even more rapidly, providing not only good quality apparel at low cost, but supporting the growing self-confidence and the optimism of almost every member of society and integrating them into society as a whole. I've remarked before about the role of clothing as a social marker. But now, even the lowest of the middle class, the industrial working class, and those above really above the status of the poorest in society, could dress well. They would no longer be turned away at restaurants, but they could in fact go in and enjoy some of the pleasures of social life. They could go to art galleries and museums. They could be accepted at public lectures. They could travel on the omnibus and the other means of public transport without being marginalized. The cheapness of clothing and the rise of fashion and being able to follow fashion at a low cost meant that clothing as a social marker no longer marginalized classes and the poor. Society was becoming somewhat more homogenized, and people were not immediately identified by class by the way they dressed. This was in part the result of the introduction of the sewing machine, and it had an enormous effect on the integration of European society as a whole. New technologies also changed things and also made things cheaper and more effective in a way that weren't instantly visible. For example, new technology and procedures in mining allowed for much deeper mines with water pumped out and air pumped in by steam engines. This meant that coal production doubled in France, tripled in Germany, and this increase in power meant that the cost of the production of manufactured goods fell. Steel replaced iron, the result of the Siemens-Martin open hearth furnace in 1864. The invention of the Bessemer converter in 1865 allowed for low-grade iron and even scrap iron to be smelted into high-quality products. In Britain, the tonnage of iron and steel exports between 1845 and 1870 rose from 1.3 to 318 million tons, a remarkable explosion. And what was this iron used for? It was used to feed the growth of the railroads, to construct the complex infrastructure of modern cities, new factories that would allow in light because of their steel structure, taller buildings with steel frames. In Germany, railroads accounted for half the production of the iron industry, and the coal industry gave the German railways half of its freight load. Steam paddle ships were used in the 1830s, but by the 1850s, the first screw propeller-driven ship was invented by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, perhaps the greatest engineer in all of British history. This innovation increased the speed of ships dramatically, making sea travel faster, safer, and cheaper. It's worth just stopping for a moment and thinking of the fact that Brunel became a hero to young England. The greatest engineer of the 19th century, the inventor of the Great Eastern, the designer of the tunnel underneath the Thames, a truly remarkable man. Previously, the heroes to England were the Duke of Wellington and perhaps the politicians and perhaps the scholars and scientists. But this man was an engineer, previously considered a mechanical trade, socially unacceptable. Now, Brunel proved that he, in fact, represented the New England. He was one of the instruments that would drive England to newer financial, economic, military, and imperial success. So, when we think then of men like Brunel and we think of these changes, we have to look at the broader implications. That now to be an engineer is no longer to be a base mechanical. It's now, in fact, to enter a profession, to be somebody who's making a significant contribution to your nation and something to be sought after. And the result was the increase in applications to schools of engineering, not in the old universities, but in the new ones, where much of the dynamic interest resided. Transportation and industrialization propelled, moreover, the internationalization of European capital. An example here is clear. The Great Western Steamship Company was a subsidiary of the Great Western Railway Company. And the railway company sought to connect London with New York by combining rail travel and sea travel to move passengers seamlessly from England to the United States through Bristol or Liverpool, across oceans to the New World. But in order for that to happen, the route had to be integrated. Rail tracks, engines, bridges, large sailing ships had to be built, and they had to work together. They had to be scheduled so that, in fact, the whole route would be a seamless whole, purchasing a ticket in London and ending up in New York or vice versa. Again, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the engineer, was given the task, changing the face of not just Britain in so doing, changing the face of the continent by expansion, but also changing the face of the world. Brunel's ships and railroads would be used to take Englishmen to the four corners of the earth, increasing immigration to the United States, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, in a world that was becoming more and more cemented by fast, safe, cheap transportation routes and new technology. Also, it's a natural extension to see how this would lead then to the transoceanic telegraph cables. It's one thing to move people and goods, something else to move words and ideas. In fact, one of Brunel's enormous ships would be used in order to link Europe with America through the transatlantic cable, ensuring that ideas could pass instantly, that information could be transferred from one part of the earth to the other in just a few seconds. Something, again, that 50 years previously would only be a dream, and before wireless telegraphy was the only way that information could be quickly transferred. These things linked an empire, the British Empire, and ultimately they linked other empires as well, the French and the German. They also linked the old world to the new in a way that integrated the concept of really Western civilization that moved beyond European civilization. The control of world markets then by European companies was greatly facilitated by these sorts of innovations. By 1840, 10 million tons of freight was being carried by European ships. But by the 1870s, that number had jumped to 25 million tons. In 1869, the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, who also was an aristocrat, the Vicomte Ferdinand de Lesseps, undertook the digging of the Suez Canal, which was to shorten travel between Asia and Europe dramatically. Between 1850 and 1870, rail links increased from 6,000 miles in 1850 to 16,000 miles in Britain. In Europe, railway mileage increased more than five-fold, from 14,000 miles in 1850 to 78,000 miles in 1870. We see the influence and the effect of Kantian statistics and numbers. We can actually trace how this progress is happening, and we can measure it. The enormous increase in the networks of European railroads, advances in switching and braking, and the establishment of standard gauge tracks, except in Russia and Spain, resulted in cheap, safe, fast travel across the entire continent. And again, what were the implications of this? What did this lead to? It led, in fact, to another change in European civilization, especially for the middle and lower middle class. Because this was an opportunity to be seized by entrepreneurs, the most famous of whom was Thomas Cook, whose portrait appears on all of the traveler's checks that bear his name. Cook packaged tours on the continent through the interconnected rail systems. And this permitted middle class, even lower middle class travelers to holiday on the continent, something previously enjoyed only by the rich. Moreover, he allowed you to buy one ticket, where everything was then taken care of by his firm. The hotels were arranged, the meals were arranged, the guides were arranged, the translators were arranged. All you did was buy the ticket and get on the train, and the next thing you knew, you were traveling around the continent in an organized way. The hospitality industry grew quickly, as did an interest in European history, languages, art, and culture among the middle classes. This allowed them to ape the cultural pretensions of the elite, but it also established a level of refinement and education as another social marker, a marker of bourgeois success, the ability to talk about art, the ability to say that you've been to the Louvre, that you've been to the Vatican, you've been to the Uffizi, added to your social relevance. This then stimulated an interest in broader education and also stimulated the foundation of the great public museums in the popular learned societies of the continent during the 1860s and 1870s. It's not an accident that the great public museums tended to be expanded or created at this time. It was a reflection of the change in cultural environment. Culture was seen then increasingly as the dominion of the middle classes, and this stimulated both formal and informal studies, now available to them in this new golden age that provided what had previously been an elite privilege to all people who could read, write, or buy a cheap ticket on a Thomas Cook tour. And even the working classes benefited, as mechanics institutes, lecture series, and museum visits were added to the charity causes of the middle classes, especially as the government began to assume more and more of the needs of their nutrition and of their working and living conditions. Now charity could work on their cultural refinement, on things that went beyond merely keeping them alive and well. Because if the working classes acquired high culture, their residual wasteful ways would be curtailed even more, and they could enter civilized society, be admitted to schools, vote in elections, and rise socially. This was an age of optimism. But the sense of optimism was clouded by the growing competition among the great powers. The industrialization of Europe and the new ideologies of national purpose created a dangerous competition for markets, raw materials, and colonies. Over the course of the century, Europe's population had more than doubled, from 200 to 460 million people. No longer content to seek new resources at home, or the resources were no longer available, industrial economies colonized or exploited Africa, Asia, South America. Improvements in ship technology meant that any European power with a deep-water port could build a fleet to increase its international trade and experiment with imperialism. The industrialization of most of Europe by the end of the 19th century meant that wealth and power were increasingly concentrated among the leading industrial nations, Britain, France, and Germany. And the so-called second powers, like Russia and Italy, were so defined because they lacked the deep industrial base and sophisticated economy capable of supporting domestic progress and foreign expansion. Nevertheless, even small industrial nations established colonial empires and gained a measure of wealth and influence well beyond their European resources. And the best example here is Belgium in the Congo. And new states such as Italy and Germany saw colonies as a means of establishing their position in Europe to compete with the established powers, and in the example of Italy, find raw materials not available in the peninsula. Imperialism, then, was a product of the race for markets, and seen as a measure of a nation's ability to compete. Optimism, though, and this is where it becomes dangerous again and begins to move the mentality towards the Armageddon of the First World War, can degenerate into exceptionalism, where it was believed that advanced nations did not have to follow generally accepted rules if breaking them advanced their national objectives. And in terms of empire, all Europeans saw the rest of the world as theirs for the taking. Imperialism spawned competition, literally producing a race for colonies, the scramble for Africa, for example, in order to get early or first advantage. By the end of the 19th century, Britain and Germany in particular were in competition for markets, raw materials, and empire. Every great power sought colonies, and every one, with the exception of Austria-Hungary, whose empire was in Europe itself, fought wars to obtain and maintain their non-European colonial territory. 1/5 of the land surface of the earth was colonized by European states: England and India, China and Africa, Germany and Southwest Africa, and the Pacific. France in Africa and Indochina. These powers had little concern for the privileges or rights or even the lives of the indigenous populations. The Berlin Conference of 1884-5, called by Bismarck, saw the European powers carve up Africa in their own interests, with little or no consultation with the colonized populations. The colonial powers set boundaries that suited their needs for raw materials and followed the routes of their explorers, with little consideration for African tribal or linguistic frontiers. The assumption was that Africa didn't belong to anyone until the European powers decided where and by whom the huge continent, much larger than the European landmass itself, would be colonized. Empires had been established long before the Industrial Revolution, but afterwards the speed of colonization increased. There were defeats. Local populations were defeated regularly by Britain, France, Italy, or Belgium, and there were instances where even the indigenous populations defeated the colonizers. But by the end of the century, only Ethiopia remained independent, defeating the Italians twice in 1887 and 1896. But it was in fact the British who ended this effective scramble for empire, and the Boer War of 1899 and the atrocities that it engendered diluted the belief in the righteousness of imperial conquest and the white man's burden. Then in 1905, Russia entered a war with Japan over northern China, only to be defeated. And it was the first instance where a major war was fought between a white and a non-white race, and the non-white race won. The race for colonies not only brought European powers into conflict with those they colonized, but also into conflict with each other, adding to the tensions in Europe that would help spark World War I. The urge to expand or found empires subsided, and European powers began to turn back to Europe, strengthen their continental alliances, and improve their militaries, setting the stage for the Great War of 1914-1918, which exploded the European belief in optimism and progress forever.